Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Taipei by Ross Feingold. He's the former Asia chairman of Republicans Abroad. In Washington, D.C., we have Larry Korb. He's the senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And joining us from Birmingham in the UK is Rosa Freedman. She's a professor of law, conflict and global development at the University of Reading. Thanks, all of you, for joining us on the Newsmakers. Ross Feingold, let me start with you. As an American, as a Republican, what do you think of Nikki Haley's resignation? Is it going to hurt the Trump White House and the Republicans ahead of those midterms?
Probably not an issue for midterm voters who are mostly looking at domestic issues such as economic growth. Obviously, President Trump is going to be making that a focus of the campaign, as well as low unemployment numbers, necessarily about foreign policy issues. To the extent that the midterm election is about foreign policy issues, obviously President Trump is talking about the reduction in tensions with North Korea, and Nikki Haley certainly had a part in getting UN members and the UN Security Council members to cooperate on those initiatives. It's unfortunate that she'll be leaving the team, but she certainly sets the tone for how the Trump administration will conduct its foreign policy making within the UN organizations, and we'll see if there could be a successor who will continue to operate at the UN in the same way that Nikki Haley did on behalf of the Trump administration.
Larry Korb, as somebody who represented his government at some of the highest seats in office, you've represented the United States. You helped set a tone, as Ross would say, in that position. What sort of tone do you think Nikki Haley set, and what did she bring diplomatically to the table on behalf of the United States at the UN?
I think she was a very good balance between some of President Trump's almost isolationist advisors and those who basically wanted to continue the policies of what we call the liberal world order. So she was a very good balancer. For example, when the UN put sanctions on Russia after the Syrians used chemical weapons, because that violated an international treaty, the president didn't want to do it, but she forced the issue. So I think she's been a good balance. And the real question now is, will you get somebody who leans in the direction of John Bolton, or somebody who leans more in the direction of Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in the United Nations?
Yeah, interesting point there. So Rosa Freedman, we have the New York Times editorial board, ostensibly left of center, I guess, or ostensibly liberal, saying she will be missed. Is that justified?
The US position at the UN under President Trump has been one of retractionism, one of taking money away from the UN, of not wanting to engage, and Nikki Haley has really been on the other side of that, pushing back, making sure she engages as a diplomat, making sure she fights for the human rights of people all across the world. There were some things that she couldn't do. She tried to prevent the US from leaving the Human Rights Council. She delayed it by a year. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to do so, but she is widely heralded by people on all sides as being an excellent diplomat, despite the fact that she had no background when she was appointed.
Rosa, it's interesting because Trump's not a fan of NATO, for example. He pulled out of the UN climate deal, pulled out of the UN Human Rights Council. Are we saying that Trump and his White House don't quite respect the international institutions, but the person who was the figurehead at the United Nations, representing the United Nations, the United States among other nations, she herself gave her best efforts in trying to mitigate some of that damage? Is that the way you see it?
Yes, I think when she was appointed, a lot of people, including myself, were very worried about the fact that someone was being appointed who had no background in international organizations. But she has engaged in such a voracious way. She has really embraced the UN and international organizations generally and multilateralism. I'm very worried that Trump, who clearly does not like international organizations, wants exceptionalism, unilateralism and a return to nationalism. And John Bolton, who has always made clear, even when he was ambassador to the UN, how much he doesn't like the United Nations or the way it currently functions. I'm worried that this administration will now do its utmost to really undermine the great work that the UN does around the world.
So Ross Feingold, the other two guests are saying she swam against the tide and ultimately maybe she was fed up. Maybe it was just too much for her. Is that how you see it?
That's not how I see it at all. And I think the press conference yesterday, the public remarks by President Trump together with Ambassador Haley, show how closely they did work together. And not only was President Trump so complimentary about her work, but Ambassador Haley went to some great length to emphasize how she's still a team player, and going forward, she's going to be campaigning for Republican candidates, will support President Trump in 2020. So this notion that she was somehow operating against the policy goals of the Trump administration or the Trump foreign policy team is probably not the truth. In fact, she was a very forceful advocate for U.S. policies at the United Nations and with the U.S. foreign partners. And that's why she was such an important part of the team and why President Trump valued her work so highly. It's because she was a forceful advocate for U.S. goals. And yes, it's fair to say that the Trump administration came in with a number of goals that were dramatically different from its predecessors, both the Obama administration as well as the Bush administration. And it's not just Ambassador Haley who was a key part of implementing that.
Right.
Originally, Secretary of State Tillerson and subsequently Secretary of State Pompeo. And the same with the change from McMaster to Bolton. Although they may have had their disagreements, Tillerson and McMaster with President Trump, and they ultimately lost their jobs. But we see that this is a team that, broadly speaking, was all on the same page, and that would include Ambassador Haley.
Okay, so Rosa Freedman and Larry Korb, I'm going to get you to respond in a moment, but Rosa Freedman, what are you and Larry talking about? She was on the same page as the Trump administration. She even threatened to take the names of those countries who didn't vote with the U.S. with regards the embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and there was no acrimony at the press conference. Looking at all of that, it seemed as if she was in lockstep with her employer.
What most people who work in or around or near the United Nations understand is that Ambassador Haley tried very hard to get Trump to change his position on Russia, to change his position in terms of Syria, that yes, she might have supported the embassy move, she might have supported money being taken away from UNRWA. These are some of the Trump policies. But in terms of the engagement, the multilateralism, the keeping the US at the table, keeping it working with its allies, keeping it spearheading global change, that really was being driven by Ambassador Haley at the same time that Donald Trump was really trying to remove the US from many tables and trying to move the US focus back to national issues only, including, you know, offending large parts of the Caribbean and Africa with some of his statements. So I think that even if she might have been in line with some of his policies, and yes, of course, they will have a very nice press conference together because she may well want to run for president one day. She's not going to burn all her bridges with the Republican Party right now. But that doesn't mean that she wasn't fighting against his policies, both in private and in the way that she worked as a diplomat at the UN.
Larry Korb.
Well, I think she did a lot for herself because she had criticized President Trump really badly in the campaign, and she is, for example, for free trade. She even spoke out against the sexual allegations against the president, but by staying mainly on his side. She did correct a few things, like Syria, and also when Trump said, we were going to attack Venezuela, she spoke out against that. But what she done is she has now kept the Trump base happy. She's moved over, and the traditional Republicans like her, in addition to being ambassador, which now gives her foreign policy credentials. She's been governor of a state that's very critical in the primaries, and basically she has lost a lot of influence. She thought after Secretary Tillerson was forced out that she would move up, but she didn't. And when Pompeo and Bolton came in, she had much less influence than she did in the beginning. And what I worry about is you might get somebody worse, for example, somebody more like Bolton there. So on balance, I think she did as well as she could have given this administration. But on the other hand, the whole foreign policy of this administration basically, in many ways, is going down the wrong path. And that, I think, is a critical thing because, as Rosa pointed out, I mean, the UN is very critical to what happens in the world. I mean, they have 50,000 peacekeepers, and we don't want to pay, our dues and things like that. That to me, will undermine national security in the long run, unless the next ambassador, keeps Trump from doing things, any more things like that.
So, Ross Feingold, one of the possible permutations is, as Larry said, a replacement who is similar to John Bolton, or might like Bolton's ideas more than others. It's a spikier foreign policy. It's a foreign policy that cares less about what the rest of the world thinks about the United States and is more aggressive and forceful. Would you be comfortable with that?
We have to think about what the key issues upcoming are for the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And frankly, it's not going to be very different than the issues that are currently on the agenda. Number one is probably North Korea. It's unresolved, and it is going to take a UN and a Security Council that's committed to continuing with the sanctions until we see significant and substantive movement by the North Koreans. Ambassador Haley is very good in that regard. She worked very closely with the ambassadors from the other Security Council countries. And the next UN ambassador will have to do that as well. And I don't see how that's one of working against other countries or being inconsistent with what President Trump wants or any conflict with John Bolton either. The next significant issue will be Syria. I think all the major powers want to see a reduction in conflict. Again, this is not a question of a different vision or zero-sum games. We see that there's a lot of effort to do something about Syria. And in fact, it's not the Trump administration or whoever is the Trump administration's ambassador to the United Nations that's an impediment to action on Syria. It's usually Russia. So again, there's a number of significant issues where I think no matter who the next ambassador is, we're going to see a lot more continuity. Obviously, in the hours after this announcement, it's very easy for pundits like us or for critics to say, oh my gosh, they're going to send another John Bolton. But the reality is probably going to be more continuity than something that people should be so concerned about.
And some form of continuity that a lot of people are very concerned about might be very close to home genetically when it comes to Donald Trump. Rosa, let me tell you a little story. We have the president suggesting that his daughter Ivanka would be dynamite in the role, and then he complained that if he did appoint her or nominate her, then people would accuse him of nepotism. She then turns to Twitter and says, listen, I don't want the job, it's not going to be me. Tell me about that story. What's your interpretation of all of that? And what does it tell us about this administration and who the next ambassador to the UN might be?
I mean, I think it tells us that this administration does not take particularly seriously the United Nations, nor its responsibility on the global stage. The fact that he might even have suggested it, even if it was a joke, demonstrates just the level of contempt that Trump holds for the UN. In terms of whether or not this was a smokescreen so that whomever else he appoints, everyone breathes a sigh of relief, that may well be the case. I suspect that he wasn't expecting this resignation, even though people had been talking about it in recent days, and that he's been caught on the back foot. And I think that tells its own story. The fact that Nikki Haley went public with this in this way, and that she hadn't gone to her president to first tell him, to first give him time to think about who the next person is. The fact that it's timed around, you know, this very political and politicized appointment of someone who's been accused of sexual violence to the Supreme Court, I think there's all sorts of factors in play here.
Right. Larry Korb, I know you're on the other side of the aisle, and I'm suggesting, or I'm suspecting that you don't want Ivanka Trump, but if you could think of a Republican who would be a good appointee, who would it be? Who would make you happy to carry the flag?
I think it would be great if they appointed Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee, who's been the chairman, Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who is not running for re-election. He would be great because he would hit the ground running. He knows a lot of obviously knows all the issues. He knows a lot of the players. Somebody like that, rather than a strictly political appointee or someone who has the hardline, vision of John Bolton. If I were the president, I'd call in Secretary Mattis and say, who would you recommend? But I think Corker would be great because, as I say, he's a Republican. He supported the Brett Kavanaugh, nomination, but he certainly, knows an awful lot about foreign policy.
Ross Feingold, who do you want?
Well, according to much speculation, the former deputy of the National Security Council, Dina Powell, is in the running for this job. Obviously, she knows the Trump administration very well. She knows foreign policy very well, and she's based in New York already. So it's an easy transition for her to take up this job.
Rosa Freedman, big picture, something that you touched on earlier on. You said this administration treats the UN with contempt. Is that ever going to change during a Trump presidency with a new appointee? Does something big need to happen for you to say, hey, they actually do respect the United Nations as an institution?
Well, the starting point would be for the UN to actually put money back in, the voluntary contributions that it's withdrawn, and for it to demonstrate through financial contributions and not to be expecting the EU and other blocs and other member states to be picking up the shortfall. I think the second key issue would be for the US to re-engage with the UN Human Rights Council. Yes, it's resigned its membership. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't be engaging and walking away completely from the tables and from the discussions in the margins of sessions. As to whether or not the US engagement will change, I don't know enough about the players within the Trump administration or who may be appointed. It worries me greatly, the position that John Bolton holds and the power that he has, because not only does the president dislike multilateralism and has made that very clear, but he's now being advised by someone who has said repeatedly that he thinks that the UN should be stripped right back in terms of numbers and size and power. And we're at a time in the world where we need the UN more than ever, and we need countries to be supporting it.
Okay, well, for the moment, there's a vacant seat in New York for the role of US ambassador to the United Nations. We'll wait and see who Donald Trump appoints to that role, and we'll do a segment about it when he does. But for the moment, I've got to thank you all. Ross Feingold, Larry Korb, and Rosa Freedman. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.